There we go. All right. So these are the two handouts that I handed out last week. And they're important. As you can imagine, since we talked about in the very beginning of our study, when you're looking at end time events, and specifically when you're looking at the book of Revelation, we understand that so much of this is drawing so much of the prophetic word that has not been fulfilled up until this point out of the Old Testament, and it is a lot. This is really drawing all of that together and the culmination of that prophecy as it plays out in time. And so there's a couple of things that we talked about last week that's important. This is a chart, a small chart. This shows the parallel between what Jesus taught in Matthew 24 and what we see in Revelation 6. And the parallels are not by accident, because both of those, both Matthew 24 and Revelation chapter 6 are talking about the same time period. In other words, they're talking about his return and the end of the age. That was the question, the second question that they asked. When is your return and the end of the age? And so in Matthew 24, he tells all of that, all the way through to the kingdom. If you look at Matthew 24 and Matthew 25, all of it is toward the Jews, even though we obviously can learn information from it that apply to the church to help us understand prophecy. But it's to the Jews. These are Jews that are asking this. They've asked about his comments about the Jewish temple, and so he's asking about the end. They're asking about the end, and so he tells them about that. And so when you compare, as we go through Revelation 6, and you look at the seals and the martyrs and all this stuff, it lines up perfectly with what Jesus said in Matthew 24 and what John saw. Remember, this is like Hollywood did a movie and you get a sneak peek at the movie. That's what you're seeing. In Revelation, you're seeing exactly what's going to play out within time in the future. And John saw it before us so he could write it all down and we would know it. And so this shows the parallels of the false Christ that Jesus started out talking about. We'll see that in the first seal. War, the second seal. Famine, the third seal. Death, the fourth seal. And martyrdom in the next seal. So there's a perfect parallel between these. This is the same time period. So that's what we're going to look at. The second one that I passed out last week was this one. And so for many years, even theologians that would be in our camp, if you will, they were somewhat confused because they lumped all of these prophecies together from the Old Testament that talk about Israel returning to the land. Okay? But after you study a while, you realize that there are some of these passages that talk about Israel being in the land, and we've got them separated here. Israel returning to their land in unbelief. And then there are other passages, these here, that if you look at them, they're talking about Israel being in their land in belief. In other words, they're believing in the Messiah. And so finally, theologians realized this is two different regatherings. The first regathering has to happen because as you go through Matthew 24 and as you go through Revelation, you see that Israel, for things to happen, Israel had to be back in the land. And we talked about that last week. Remember, he's talking to Israel, he's saying all this happens, and then he says, hey, when the abomination of desolation takes place, which has to be in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, then you're to flee, you know. And so you've got in the prophecy in Matthew 24, and then later we'll see in Revelation 11 that there's a temple. In other words, Israel has to be back in their land. Well, that was not true for 1900 years. Until 1948. Actually, the return started in the late 1800s because, somewhere around the turn of the century, I can't remember the exact date of the Bolshevik Revolution, but remember the Bolshevik Revolution, Nancy and I were talking about this the other day. How many of you have ever seen Fiddler on the Roof? Man, if you've not seen Fiddler, I think I've seen it 3 times, and I could watch it again right now. It's just an incredible movie. And but that was way before Hitler persecuted the Jews. That was the pogroms, what they call the pogroms, and that was the Bolsheviks persecuting the Jews. So those kinds of things happened in different countries, and the Jews started to move back in the 1800s. Late 1800s, they started to move back to Israel. So, and then of course, you know about the Balfour Declaration and the division and stuff at the end of World War II, and the British Mandate. So where the British ruled over that until a certain time, and then they pulled out and basically some of them turned against the Jews. They worked as military, supporters of the Jordanians and some of the others that attacked Israel in 1948. And so anyway, so that's this here. That's the regathering before the tribulation occurs. And so that's still going on. There's still, since 1948, there have been hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jewish people leave other countries and go back to Israel. So that regathering is still occurring. And it will occur until at some point politically, the Antichrist rises and he signs that covenant with them, which is Daniel 9:27, and at that point, as we saw in Daniel chapter 12, God is going to use this period of time to break their pride and to bring them to Him, and there's going to be a Holocaust that exceeds all Holocausts beforehand during that period of time. But then you have these set of passages, because at the end of that period of time, Israel recognizes their Messiah, and he returns to save them from the Antichrist and his armies. This is the kind of the culmination of the whole campaign of Armageddon. And after that, if you remember this, guys, remember in Matthew 13, when Matthew 12, Israel had committed the unpardonable sin. They had attributed the work of the Spirit of God in healing a man to Beelzebub and to Satan. And so Jesus said that's the unpardonable sin. In other words, you've got the Son of God before you. You got the Spirit of God working a miracle, and you have no out here other than to attribute that to Satan. So this is the Jewish leaders. It's this is it. And so you're like Isaiah said. You have ears but you can't hear. You have eyes but you can't see. And so I'm going to start talking in parables so that people who are spiritually alive and have spiritual insight, they can figure out the meaning of the parable, but you will not, because you're dead spiritually. And so in those parables, you remember in several, one of them, he talks about the end of the age, and at the end of the age, the angels come in and they separate the righteous from the unrighteous. And the unrighteous get thrown in that place, you remember, that talks about where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's, of course, a place of eternal torment that we would call the lake of fire or hell. And the others will enter the kingdom. Okay? And so he says the same thing in Matthew 24. He talks about separating the Gentile nations, the sheep from the goats, the believing Gentiles from the unbelieving Gentiles. And once that separation takes place, he tells the righteous who have put faith in him during this time to enter into the kingdom promised to them before the foundation of the earth, and that type of thing. And of course, the unrighteous are cast into the lake of fire that he prepared for the devil and his angels. And so that's what's going on here. So this gathering here is a gathering of the righteous Jews that are all over the world, scattered all over the world during the tribulation period. And now he's bringing them back to Israel because Israel is going to be their home with Jesus himself ruling, right? During the millennial kingdom. So that's what this is. And it's important to understand there are two regatherings. One is they are in belief. The other is in unbelief. And it makes sense, right? I mean, he wouldn't gather them here if they were in belief and then put them through tribulation, right? No, that 7 years is still to fulfill the goal he had for those 490 years. Do y'all remember that? I want to read that because I said that last week, and it's been a while since we looked at that. So if you turn back with me to Daniel chapter 9, and I promise after that we'll jump into Revelation 6. Whether you believe me or not, that's what we're going to do. So I'm sorry.
Write that down.
Yeah, right. Sign it. Okay. So remember, Gabriel appeared to Daniel. He's praying to God. He's confessing the sin of the nations. Gabriel appears, and Gabriel gives him an understanding. There's going to be 70 weeks of 7 years, which adds up to 490 years, right? We've talked about the timing of that. That started when they went back and built the moat and the walls and all that stuff. We know the decree. You find that in Nehemiah chapter 2. But he tells him that what this time is for is this. Verse 24. Because remember, we talked about Daniel is thinking, okay, we're going to go back to the land, in just a few years. But Gabriel's prophecy looks far beyond that. Gabriel's prophecy looks for the ultimate returning of Israel to their land. And he says, before that happens, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. So this is talking about the Jews, your people, Daniel, and Jerusalem, your holy city. And this is what's going to happen in those 490 years. He says, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy or the most holy place. So this takes us all the way into the millennium, where everlasting righteousness starts. The vision and the prophecy is all fulfilled, and the most holy place is anointed because he's there in the great temple in Jerusalem ruling. So these are the things that this time is supposed to fulfill. We know that time clock started Nehemiah 2. It clicked off until the Messiah showed up and presented himself in the triumphal entry to Israel and their leaders. And of course, they didn't want anything to do with him. In fact, what they did was, we're gonna plan right now. We're gonna kill this guy. We need to eliminate this guy. And shortly after, Judas went and made the agreement with them, and eventually, but he was cut off. Remember, in verse 26 of that same chapter, he says the Messiah, and this is the first mention of the title Messiah in the Bible. The Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. That's at the end of the 483 years. That's, if you're looking for the passage I'm talking about, that's Daniel 9, 26. The Messiah will show up, but he will be cut off and have nothing. That was Jesus. He showed up, he offered himself, he was rejected by the nation, and he didn't have anything. In other words, he didn't have a kingdom because they didn't receive him as Messiah. And then we start talking about the prince of the people that is to come, and they'll destroy the moat and the temple and all this stuff. That's in verse 20 in the latter part of chapter 26. 9:26. Daniel 9:26. And then in 9:27, that prince that is to come, he makes a covenant with the many. Again, the many has to be the Jewish leaders, it has to be Israel, because that's the context. You got to interpret within the context. Okay. So that's important. That's a good primer for what we talk about now. So if you have your Bibles, now turn them to Revelation chapter 6. We finally get to start that. All right? And again, if you have questions along the way, just write those down. Milton brought me a question, so we'll deal with that next week. All right. So we have Revelation 6. You have your notes on Revelation 6. We know who the Lamb is, right? That's the resurrected Messiah, and it talks about the fact that he died for and redeemed people, and so because of that, he's worthy. He did what made him worthy to take the earth back as the second Adam. The last Adam, actually, is what the 1 Corinthians says. The last Adam. He's the one that is going to come and is going to rule perfectly according to the Father's plan. It's the thing that Adam failed at, our ancestor. And by the way, if you want to blame Adam, you can, because it started with Adam, but if it was us, we would have done the same thing. Okay? Okay, so it says, Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying, as with a voice of thunder, Come. Remember, he's heard that before, right? Except in John has. Remember, John in the beginning of Revelation 4. And after these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven, and first voice which I had heard, like the sound of a trumpet, this time speaking with me, said, Come up here. So that's when John went to heaven, saw the throne room, all this kind of stuff. And now he sees the Lamb. He breaks the seal, and he tells him to come. Voice of thunder, come. And he says, verse 2 says, I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Okay, let me tell you something. When you're interpreting prophecy like this, if you don't stay with the context and you don't try to find some kind of Old Testament context, there can be 1,000,000 translations, right? I mean, maybe not 1,000,000, but, almost. I mean, if you did, well, I think a bow means this. Maybe a bow means that. You know what I mean? So you have to be careful. And that's why in interpreting, especially the book of Revelation, it is so incredibly important to understand all the other prophecies and how they fit together. We talk about systematic theology, the understanding of how we're saved, or soteriology, or the understanding of how we are made holy, sanctification, all that type of thing. how that's kind of it's like a puzzle. You have to look at all the passages that deal with that, put those together to figure out how that works. Well, in prophecy, it's the same way. All of the prophecy gives us little clues and little pieces of you find. How many of you love to put puzzles together? Okay, a few. My wife's she loves to put puzzles together. I don't like putting puzzles together. I don't like all those little pieces, Now, this kind of puzzle, I can go for, but your regular puzzle, no. But it's very much like a puzzle. Because along the way, Zechariah, even Deuteronomy has prophetic sections that give us information about what's going on in this passage and what's going on in this book. And so what people have tried to do is put all of that together and see how it comes. I like that. I like musical background, how it all goes together. So we have. I'm just gonna put this out there. So we have seen this. We have seen that in the book of Daniel, that in the last 7 years, there is someone who apparently has the power to make a covenant with Israel. Okay, would you agree to that? We've seen that. Now, it also said that person was going to come from the people. He was the prince who was going to come from the people that were going to come and destroy Jerusalem. Well, we know exactly who that was because we can look back in history to figure that out, right? That was the Roman legions. They came, they surrounded Jerusalem, they starved people to where they didn't have any food, and eventually they were so weakened they broke down the walls, they leveled the temple, they destroyed the city. And if you've ever seen the old movie Masada, you know that they also surrounded Masada and eventually did the same thing. They built that ramp up there to get to them, and of course they got there and they had all committed suicide, But my point is, as you translate the book of Revelation, you have to know all of that stuff because God's given us information, and this is like adding another piece to that. Okay, so we know what's going to start those 7 years. It's not the rapture of the church. It's not, any kind of political thing going on, that we can put our finger on. The only thing we know for sure is what starts that time clock is a political figure who is prominent, and he is able to go in and work some kind of a deal. I mean, we haven't been successful at that yet, have we? We sure have tried for a long time. The two-state solution and this, that, and the other. People have tried and tried and tried, but this guy's going to be able to make it happen. He's going to make it happen, and there is going to be a treaty signed. And so, taking that information and looking at this, what you see is a white horse, and every place else in the Bible, that talks about the saints, it talks about Christ, it talks about where white, the symbol of white, is used as their clothing. It talks about it refers to righteousness, right? So you say, okay, we're going to go with that. This appears to be somebody that's righteous. Now he has a bow, but many have pointed out the fact that it doesn't mention any kind of arrows. It doesn't say bow and arrow. It just says bow. So apparently he has some military weight behind him, but he doesn't use it. And it also says he has a crown. But the crown here is, I think we talked about this last time, didn't you? It's Stephanos, it's not diadema. Diadema is the Greek word for a ruler's crown. And Stephanos is the wreath for the victor. It's the victor's wreath in the Olympics. That's the way it was used. They didn't get medals and all that stuff in the original Greek games. Olympic Games, they got wreaths, you know. And so you have someone here. They appear to be righteous. They have a bow, but they're not using it. You know, no arrows. They are apparently are rewarded for something. They have this crown. But then it says he went out conquering and to conquer. So he's conquering without using military power, which seems to present somebody who is doing it diplomatically. Does that make sense?
It does, but would that say that probably this person would have access to military power, tanks or aircraft?
Yeah.
You know, he has the access, but not.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So he is apparently a political figure. You know, he somehow is able to broker this deal between, you know, probably Arab nations and Israel to bring this peace treaty to occur. And at least on the surface, he appears to be righteous. Now, probably this is a false righteousness, but that is the appearance. But he is conquering and to conquer. So there is a motivation here that's not totally pure if he's conquering to conquer.
But he's going to be, they thought of as the Messiah because
Possibly.
he has all this power and charisma and he's conquering. That's what they were looking for.
And there are some, you know, there are different perspectives on that. In other words, some believe that he will be accepted by some as their Messiah. That's why and there could be a little truth to that. And the reason is, if you look at the parallel to this in Matthew 24, the first thing that Jesus said when he started to answer their question is, there are going to be false messiahs. You know, our translation says Christ because it's Christos in the Greek, but the Christos is just the name for Messiah in Greek. So, you know, that's why we say Jesus Christ. Really, it's Jesus the Messiah. I mean, that's what it'd be in Hebrew. Yeshua HaMashiach, you know. And so there is a possibility that some see him as that. It appears that he's Gentile, though. That's the problem with thinking that the majority of the Jews will see him as Messiah, because he came from the Roman Empire. You know what I mean? So I guess we'll find that out at some point. But so that's the first step. So this apparently is where the tribulation starts. He opens that seal. There's a signing of the covenant. There is a peace treaty brokered. Things seem to be going pretty well, you know. And so that's basically what you have in your notes. One of the things that I want to point out over to the far right in your notes, it says, the Lamb will break the seals, and the last seal contains the trumpets, and the trumpets contain the bowls. We looked at that. That's what that diagram was, right? It's all, in other words, it's all connected together. Once you break one, it breaks the other, it breaks the other. It just all unravels over those 7 years. But what we see in the book of Revelation is what all of that leads to eventually is the Messianic kingdom. That's where we're headed. And again, that's because the Lamb is worthy to do this, because he's the one that has purchased the earth back. He's purchased the people back. He's redeemed the people back. And he will take over and rule the world again and fulfill what the first Adam failed at. Okay, so verse 3. So we've had some political victory here. There's some peace going on. But when the second seal breaks, he says, I heard a second living creature saying, come. So this is those creatures, those living creatures, that probably the ones that are sitting in front of the throne that we saw. It says, and another, a red horse went out to him. Oh, let me back up. The come is not to John. The come is actually to these horses, these horsemen and these horses, right? I mean, look at how it's read, because I think I said that wrong earlier. Verse 1, then I saw when the Lamb broke out of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying, as with a voice of thunder, come. And I looked, and behold, a white horse. And he said, in other words, who is sovereignly in control here? God is. God's giving this command to the angels, and the angels are telling these people on these horses to come forth. In other words, you have to realize, and you, all of you know this because you've studied the Bible long enough, God is not the author of evil. He is not responsible for evil. He is totally righteous. But God certainly uses evil in His plan. Again, He gave Satan permission to attack Job. Sometimes he does that. Why? Because, as we saw in Romans 8:28, He works all things together for good. Sometimes He knows that will cause, as it did with Job, to be even more righteous man in the end. And that's the only time He uses it. Now, He's using it here to punish an evil, God-rejecting world, but He's also using it for good in the sense that He is purifying His people to bring them to the point to recognize the Messiah at the end of this period of time. And so I just wanted to go back and correct that. So verse 3, when He broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come.
This is a figuration of the Antichrist.
Yes. Yeah, personification.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. And so let's see, verse 4, and another, a red horse went out to him who sat on it, and it was granted to take peace from the earth. So that peace was pretty short-lived, wasn't it? There's already conflict. Take peace from the earth, it says. And look at the terminology. It was granted. Again, this is not Satan running wild on the earth. No. This is God using evil to bring about His good purposes in the end. So He granted this one the ability to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. So you have war here, right? All right. So then, and on your notes, we just talked about seal number 1. We were already on page 3, seal number 2, the red horse. So the writer sets out on a we get our, this is pyros. This is the Greek word. This means more than just red. It means fiery red. This is where we get pyromaniac. Have you ever heard that word? You know what a pyromaniac is? He sets fire. He's the guy they catch out in the woods, and he's set a fire to the forest, and they're messed up, doing this. And so that's pyros is the Greek word here. This is a fiery red horse, and a great sword was given to him. So men begin to kill one another. The great sword, no doubt, represents all instruments of war that kill people. So the instrument of war back then was the sword primarily. I mean, the Romans had the spear too, but the Romans also had 2 different swords. They had the big sword, but the little sword where they could get in with their shield, and they could get in close and jab, and that's where they did most of their damage. Not from distance, but they just walked across there with those big shields And those shields were to where they could just sit down behind them and go like that if the arrows came. And then they just kept going, and they get that little sword out about that long. And
Chop it off.
man to man, it was rough on most people because they knew how to use it. So, so they're starting to kill with the sword. The piece is gone. Fiery red most certainly represents a span of slaughter and bloodshed. And again, this is divine authority permitting this, because it said it was granted. All right, so things are not going well now, early in these 7 years. And remember, this would be the period in the first 3.5 years. Remember, both in Daniel and in Revelation, we will see the periods broken up into 2 periods, basically. In fact, some theologians believe that in the second when Jesus spoke of this in Matthew 24, he talked about the Great Tribulation, and they put that the Great Tribulation as the second half of the tribulation, because it does seem to be more and more intense in the sense of suffering on the earth as this progresses. All right, and remember if this is parallel with the seals in Matthew 24, the early part of Matthew 24, as we believe it is, then when he gets through with that first section of Matthew, he says, this is just the beginning of birth pains. I mean, you think this is bad? You just wait. And then right after that, in Matthew 24:15, is where he talks about the abomination of desolation. So we will see him use 3.5 years, 42 months, because remember, we're talking about a lunar year, 360 days. Times and a half a time. So there's various ways that the 3.5 years are mentioned. Okay, so in verse 5 he says, and when he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature saying, come. I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the 4 living creatures, saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine. This is interesting. So if you look at your notes, so we've got a black horse and a rider on that horse. The rider sits on a black horse and has a pair of scales in his hand. And it goes further than just saying the scales. It gives, and of course, again, you have to extrapolate back when this was written, what were the value of these grains, and why the differences, and what is the cost. Okay? So as you look at this, that's what you have to do. And so the rider brings famine, which is obvious, which is the natural result of war brought by the previous horse. So see how this, you see this in history, right? I can remember when I was a little kid, things like organizations like Food for the Hungry or Food for the Children or something like that. This would have been in the 70s. And of course, almost all of those kids were black kids. And you know why? Because there was tribal warfare going on in Africa. And so if you are in tribal warfare and you go in and you wipe out the other tribe's crop for the year, what are they going to do? In other words, the natural result of war is famine. Used to, in ancient warfare, sometimes they'd go in. In fact, this is part of what happened to Israel. When we hear about in the Old Testament about the cedars of Lebanon and all this kind of stuff, all this forestation that used to be there. No, those people would come in and they'd cut down all the trees. They wanted to devastate the land that they took over so that those people could never rebel against them anymore. And so, again, this is a logical, natural process. You have a breaking of a covenant. You have all of a sudden war, and now all the crops have been destroyed. Maybe even, water sources have been poisoned. You know, if you've even you know the Middle East has not changed much. You know, a lot of times when our troops were over there in the Middle East in the late 1990s and it was the early 2000s, the second Gulf War. I don't remember the dates, but I mean they'd throw goats and everything in the water so it, you know, it putrefied and stuff. I mean this is exactly what happens in war. That's what you're saying. This is a logical thing going on here, and so you have, and so what's the scales about? Where it makes sense, doesn't it? The pair of scales represent commerce. Goods will be weighed to determine their cost. When we lived in Bolivia, still in third world countries, some of the things you bought, you would go in, and just like you read about in the Bible, they would have a set of scales with the little different weight, pieces of metal. So you weigh it out, and it would cost so much per pound, and that's what you have going on here. The cost mentioned a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. So the denarius was an average day's wage. So you have a situation here where a person has to work all day to make enough money for that one day to buy food for the next day. And then he's got to work the next day to have food the next day. That's pretty bad.
A lot of people starve from this right now.
Yeah, and people will obviously starve during this period of time. Wheat was more nutritional. This is why the wheat and the barley. Wheat was more nutritional, but would only feed one person. And so 3 quarts of barley would feed a small family. So this is depicting the drought conditions, or the famine conditions. The prohibition of damaging the oil and the wine. Oil and wine were luxury items of the rich, seem to show the rich will not be affected as much. Now, I have read different things on that. Again, we're trying to figure it out because it doesn't tell us. Oil was often used as medicine, and so I've read commentators that said, they didn't damage the oil because that is really needed to treat people, and I don't think we know exactly. But if this is true, this would not surprise me. Why? Because in most situations in wartime, you know who get out lighter than anybody else? The wealthy. And I want to tell you, if most of our world has gone the way we're trying to go in the U.S. and where Western Europe has gone, a very socialistic approach, you always have a ruling elite, folks, and they always have all they need. So I'm just saying, I'm not saying that's exactly what this is saying, but I'm saying it's a possibility. It is a possibility.
Well, I think we have a two-class system now.
There's no, yeah, and again, that's where socialism goes. You shrink the middle class. There is only a ruling class and a working class. That's where people that like to control people want you to go, and that's exactly what happened in Bolivia when we were there. You had, and this is a side issue to a certain degree, but politically, this is what happens in a lot of countries. A lot of countries that try democracy and a more of a capitalistic approach. Many times, the people that are in power in those countries that try to go that way, they don't have the Judeo-Christian foundation that the United States. The reason why capitalism has worked so good for so long and is not working quite as good now is because you don't have the Judeo-Christian foundation anymore. When you have that foundation, you have people who are making money and investing it and helping the poor people. In other words, they help build them up, educate them, provide education, all this kind of stuff. In Bolivia, that did not happen as well, because that's a Catholic country, an old Catholic country, and you don't have the Judeo-Christian foundation. In fact, a lot of the ruling elite were more like, better to keep them uneducated. They're less threatening to us, type thing.
One of the biggest
Well,
things-
all socialists have to do, all the Soviets had to do is go in and train a Che Guevara and people like that? And then you say, and then you convince people, if we take over, if we do roadblocks and we cause enough problems, sound like maybe something that might have happened here a couple of years ago. We cause enough problems, and we're working for the people in power, so they're not going to arrest us and convict us. You know, you cause enough problems, and we'll